This is Lesson 23.5, the Dreyfus Affair. How did a major miscarriage of justice happen to Captain Alfred Dreyfus, and how did it change French society? College Board Topic 7.2, Nationalism. We've seen this already. Explain how the development and spread of nationalism affected Europe from 1815 to 1914. Nationalists, as we've seen before, encouraged loyalty to the nation in a variety of ways, including romantic idealism, liberal reform, political unification, racialism with a concomitant anti-Semitism, notice that is in bold, and chauvinism, justifying national aggrandizement. And while during the 19th century Western European Jews became more socially and politically acculturated, Zionism, a form of Jewish nationalism, developed late in the century as a response to growing anti-Semitism throughout Europe. So our place is France. Our time frame is 1894 to 1906. Key concepts in the Dreyfus Affair: the bordereau, the statistics or statistical section, the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, and anti-Semitism. Key people in the Dreyfus Affair: of course, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, Emile Zola, Major Ferdinand Walzen Esterhazy, Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, Mathieu Dreyfus, and Major Hubert Joseph Henri. Intro. The Dreyfus Affair is a textbook case of a complete miscarriage of justice. It's a great study on how justice can be miscarried, how it gets covered up, what kind of thinking and logic go into a blatant miscarriage of justice like this, and it gives you a great idea of what the procedural red flags are. The Dreyfus Affair had a tremendous effect on all of Europe. It forced the Republic of France to clarify its values. It consumed all aspects of French life for years, especially in the press and in public opinion. It undermined the Third Republic. There was considerable public disorder, even fear of a civil war. The French, against the background of this case, struggled with who they were as a people and what values they stood for. French society was deeply divided between the Dreyfusards, who were for the defendant, Alfred Dreyfus, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who were against him. We can describe these. The Dreyfusards were pro-Republican. In other words, they were in favor of a republic ruled by law. They were anti-clerical. They were against the excessive authority of the church. They believed that the rights of the individual French citizen were paramount, more important than anything else. And they believed, in keeping with that even the sacred French army had to be governed by the same laws of justice that governed the rest of France. Military reason of state could not superimpose itself on law. On the other hand, the anti-Dreyfusards were pro-army, and they were mostly Catholic. And they saw Alfred Dreyfus as an alien Jew. And they felt that he was existentially guilty, whether he was technically guilty or not. Existentially guilty meaning guilty by your very nature. And they felt that protection of the army's honor was a matter of national security, especially since everybody knew that the army would be needed someday to once again defend France against the Germans. Even if protecting the army's honor meant forging documents, going so far as to call any such forgery a patriotic forgery. Even if protecting the army meant flawed legal and judicial procedures. And the Dreyfus Affair exposed deep anti-Semitism in French society and in the French military to the entire world, as well as blatant corruption. Historians have said this about the Dreyfus Affair: it's the glory of France that it ended the way it did, and it is the dishonor of France that it took place at all. The Dreyfus Affair involved literally hundreds of people. It involved widespread public outrage. It sparked the nationalist movement among the Jews, called Zionism. Zionism saw its fulfillment in the establishment of the State of Israel in Palestine in 1948. Historians have debated the details of the case for decades, but they all agree on this: that Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish French army officer, was completely innocent of spying or treason. Alfred Dreyfus was more of a French patriot than he was Jewish. He came from wealth in the German-occupied area of Alsace. He had refused to work in the family business and instead left Alsace to go to Paris. Dreyfus had wanted nothing more than to be a true Frenchman. And being a true Frenchman in his day meant you joined the military. Dreyfus was also a family man with a wife and 2 small children. The French army that Alfred Dreyfus joined was trying to modernize and democratize itself. Traditionally, military officers had always graduated from the Saint-Cyr Military College. But now the military was accepting more and more graduates from the newer, non-traditional École Polytechnique. And there was deep resentment of officers coming up through the ranks from this upstart college. And Alfred Dreyfus had graduated from that school. The Dreyfus Affair all started because France and Germany were in the middle of an arms race. Artillery secrets were a huge deal. A number of embarrassing espionage cases had already hit French newspapers. So French intelligence and counterintelligence were getting a lot of negative attention. French counterintelligence was called the Statistics Section of the War Ministry, the SR. You can also call it the Statistical Section. And the Minister of War at this time was Auguste Mercier, and he was under a lot of pressure to look good in front of the French public. French spies had intercepted authentic notes between the German military attaché, Count Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen, and the Italian military attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Count Alessandro Panizzardi, both stationed at their embassies in Paris. And these notes would show that the 2 men were intimate. And in this day and age, if you could insert Judaism and homosexuality into a case in any way at all, then you could go a long way towards getting a conviction. It all started with a slip of paper that would be called the bordereau. In September 1894, a French spy housekeeper at the German embassy snagged a torn-up slip of paper with writing on it from the German military attaché's trash can. The French word for a slip of paper with a note on it is a bordereau, and this bordereau later came to be known as the bordereau. This note, this bordereau, was authentic, and it said that some documents with specifications on the new 120 caliber Baquet gun were going to be delivered to a foreign power. That particular artillery piece had recently undergone numerous top-secret improvements. It was one of the first modern howitzers. It had a recoil system. It had pneumatic brakes. And this bordereau was solid evidence that somebody in France was providing technical information about that gun to the Germans. So this was a big deal. War Minister Mercier was eager for a win in the public eye. So he said, we got to find out who this culprit is. And it's obviously some artillery guy. So they picked the person whom they thought was the most likely culprit, and that was Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Now, you can avoid a lot of hard legal work if you can get a confession from the accused. So they brought Captain Alfred Dreyfus in and tried for hours to get him to confess to writing that bordereau. Eventually, however, they realized that Captain Alfred Dreyfus was not going to confess to writing the bordereau. So now you have to go to Plan B. Now they had to pin the bordereau on Alfred Dreyfus without the benefit of a confession. But nobody could match the handwriting on the bordereau to Dreyfus's handwriting, because he didn't write it. So they got Alphonse Papillon, and Papillon was the inventor of something we're all familiar with, the mugshot. So you know he must be an expert on handwriting since he invented the mugshot, right? And he looked at the bordereau, and he said, this is what we call an auto forgery. His theory was this. Dreyfus wrote the bordereau himself, pretending to be somebody else doing a bad imitation of himself. And that's what you call an auto forgery. And that way, if the criminal ever gets caught with something he's written, he can always say, I didn't write that. It's a forgery. So on October 29, 1894, La Libre Parola, the Free Word, a blatantly anti-Semitic newspaper, broke the story about Dreyfus. La Libre Parola's editor, Edouard Drumont, had already written a blatantly anti-Semitic book in 1886 called Jewish France. And this book was so wildly popular in France that it had gone through 140 printings. There were probably more copies of this book, literally, than there were Jewish French people. And Drumont's Dreyfus story put the case into the anti-Semitic realm from this point on. La Libre Parola began a vicious, non-stop smear campaign against Alfred Dreyfus and any of his supporters that went on for years. France had, for several years, had an obsession with its very tiny Jewish population, about 0.22% of the population, about 1/5 of 1%. In 1892, a large French company that was building the Panama Canal went bankrupt. 500 million francs of investors' money was lost. And this became known as the Panama Scandal. And it was discovered in this scandal that a number of Jewish financiers had been bribing members of parliament to keep the company's financial difficulties a secret from the public being French investors. And that scandal was so huge that it destabilized the entire republic. And it also lent credence to the anti-Semitic things that Edouard Drumont had been saying in his book, Jewish France. And this scandal greatly increased anti-Semitic feelings in France. Before that, in 1882, the Catholic Union General Bank failed, and many French investors were financially devastated by that failure. And the failure of the bank triggered a stock market crash in France, and the president of the bank publicly blamed Jewish finance and governmental Freemasonry for the financial disaster. Many conservatives and Catholics believed that the powerful Jewish Rothschild family had deliberately caused the entire financial crash. This was also a time of rapid urbanization, rapid modernization, and rapid secularization in France. And don't forget what secularization is. Many conservatives and Catholics who didn't like what they were seeing, who didn't like all of this rapid change, blamed Jewish power for anti-clerical legislation that was going on, things regarding education, civil marriage, the Jesuits, divorce, etc. And they blamed Jewish power for parliamentary rottenness. So the military wrote up an indictment of Alfred Dreyfus for espionage. And it outlined some personal things about Dreyfus. For example, that Dreyfus spoke several languages, including German. That he may have been seen by somebody gambling. That he had this really great memory. And that they've got the bordereau, which Alfred Dreyfus obviously wrote, unless you're willfully ignorant enough to see differences between his writing and the writing on the bordereau. And even the fact that there's no other evidence at all actually proves he's guilty if you look at it the right way, because he's the type of guy who knows how to make evidence disappear, right? Alfred's brother, Mathieu Dreyfus, went out and got the best criminal defense lawyer available, Edgar Demange. And Edgar Demange got the case file and was shocked to discover that it was almost completely empty. There was the bordereau and almost nothing else in the folder. In other words, the prosecution was taking this case to trial with almost no case and no reliable evidence. So the trial took place on December 19th, 1894. It was a closed trial, in other words, closed to the public. 7 military officers were on the jury. The public knew about the trial, but it had no idea that there was really no case and no evidence at all. War Minister Auguste Mercier had publicly called Alfred Dreyfus guilty. But Auguste Mercier's interest in condemning Dreyfus was clear and obvious, to have his war ministry and the SR, the statistics section, look good to the public. The trial started off well for Alfred Dreyfus. The bordereau was obviously not in Dreyfus' handwriting. Dreyfus himself got on the stand, defended himself point by point. A dozen witnesses supported his statements. The prosecution could not show any motive. Dreyfus was rich. He was not in need of money. Spies are always deep in debt and penniless. That's why they become spies. They need the money. Dreyfus' Jewishness didn't even get mentioned in the trial. But then the trial took a turn for the worse. Alphonse Papillon took the stand and he gave his auto-forgery theory. To the right, you see a demonstration mugshot that Alphonse Papillon made of his 2-year-old son, Francois, who is detained for nibbling on some pears. What a crime. Lock him up. Then there came one more witness, a Major Hubert Joseph Henri. We will learn a lot more about him. And Major Henri took the stand, and he also worked for French counterintelligence, the SR, the statistical section. And Henri swore under oath that Dreyfus was a traitor. And Henri knew this because a, quote, respectable person, unquote, had accused Dreyfus. And when Alfred Dreyfus demanded to be able to confront this unnamed respectable person, he was refused. So the 7 officers who were judge and jury went to deliberate the case and come up with a verdict. But before they went to deliberate, they were given a secret file with some documents in it for them to review. And this file was never shown to Dreyfus' defense lawyer. Edgar Demange didn't even know about it. What was in this secret file? Did the jury read the documents in the file? How did it impact the verdict? No one knew. The file's very existence was a secret. Remember that file. These 7 officers on this jury had a lot to think about. Do they believe Alphonse Papillon's auto-forgery theory? Do they believe Major Hubert Joseph Henri's hearsay from this unidentified so-called respectable person? Or do they believe everything else they've seen? No motive, lots of character witnesses, Dreyfus' defense of himself, lack of any real evidence. Dreyfus was unanimously convicted of collusion with a foreign power. He was sentenced to life in prison, and on January the 5th, 1895, he went through the public ceremony of degradation. In that ceremony, his medals, badges, stripes, and cuffs were all torn from his uniform. His sword was broken in half. He was paraded around in front of all his comrades. A crowd shouted, "Down with Dreyfus" and "Down with the Jews" the entire time. And then he was sent to prison on Devil's Island off the coast of French Guiana. There have been many movies made of the Dreyfus Affair, and below is a link to a dramatic reenactment of the Ceremony of Degradation. In the 1970s, Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman starred in a movie called Papillon, and it was a movie about this Devil's Island prison where Dreyfus spent time. Devil's Island was a brutal, horrific place, and that might have been the end of the entire Dreyfus Affair. And there's a link below here to a scene from the movie Papillon, which shows just how bad a place it was. But then 2 things happened. His brother Mathieu Dreyfus and Georges Picquart. The public had a growing obsession with the Dreyfus Affair, even after Dreyfus went to Devil's Island. It was the main topic of discussion all over France. Families were divided over it. The media was constantly feeding the public new articles and editorials and cartoons about the case. There was even a Dreyfus Affair board game that you could buy and play with all your friends. A film series was even made about the Dreyfus Affair as the case was being played out. Moving pictures was a brand new medium. And what's the first thing they're making movies about? The Dreyfus Affair. Each movie in the series was about a minute long. There were 9 installments for a grand total of 13 minutes, and it's all on YouTube. You can watch it. Dreyfus' brother Mathieu had kept fighting to keep the case in the public eye, and he was finding new evidence. And he was getting prominent people to doubt his brother's guilt, and he was building support for a retrial. Mathieu Dreyfus had connections to the president of France himself. Mathieu eventually found out about the existence of that secret file that his brother's defense was never shown. No kidding, Mathieu actually had a woman who had seen the secret file remember it under hypnosis. That's how he found out about it. And Mathieu made public the existence of this secret file that his brother's defense had never been given the opportunity to see. Also, in July 1895, something happened that made our hostile witness from the trial, Hubert Joseph Henri, really, really angry. Henri was passed up for promotion to be the head of the SR. The new head of the SR was a Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart. Hubert Joseph Henri remained second in command. Picquart hated Dreyfus just like many others did. But he was also a strong believer in military justice, even for a Jew whom he despised. Georges Picquart had been in the courtroom as a reporter to the General Staff of the War Ministry during Dreyfus' trial, and Picquart had followed the Dreyfus case ever since. There's a movie on Amazon Prime Video called Prisoner of Honor, which deals almost exclusively with Georges Picquart and his involvement in the Dreyfus Affair. Many of the people and events discussed in this very lesson are depicted in that movie. In March 1896, Picquart's SR department got hold of an unsent telegram from the German military attaché. It had been stolen from the German embassy by French spies before the Germans could actually send it. And it was a document that was later called the Petit Bleu. And here's a picture of it. The Petit Bleu was addressed to a certain French officer named Major Ferdinand Walzen Esterhazy. Esterhazy had previously worked in the SR before receiving numerous promotions and moving on. And Georges Picquart became curious about this Esterhazy person. So he pulled some letters that Esterhazy had written while he had served in the SR. Picquart was shocked to find that Esterhazy's handwriting matched the handwriting on the bordereau, and they matched perfectly. Remember that the bordereau was the authentic document that was confirmed to be the work of a foreign agent working for the Germans to deliver French artillery secrets to them. Just to be clear, Esterhazy didn't write the Petit Bleu, he was just named in the Petit Bleu. And that led Picquart to examine old documents that Esterhazy had written, which matched the handwriting on the bordereau. These two documents should never have been linked to each other. But Georges Picquart was so astute that he discovered their unlikely connection. The Petit Bleu provided Picquart with a name, Esterhazy. And Picquart just happened to have old samples of Esterhazy's handwriting. Picquart just happened to recognize those samples as being similar to the handwriting on the bordereau. Had these unlikely events not happened, Alfred Dreyfus would have died in prison without the world ever knowing that he was innocent. It really makes you wonder how many miscarriages of justice really do go undiscovered forever. This all led Picquart to pull that secret file that had been so pivotal in Dreyfus' unanimous conviction. As the head of the SR, Picquart knew about the secret file and had access to it. This was the secret file that Dreyfus' jury had seen just before arriving at a unanimous conviction, so it had to have something juicy in it. And Picquart was again shocked to discover that this secret file contained no evidence. It contained some documents. Most of these documents were totally irrelevant to the case. There were a couple of letters from 1894 between the military attachés of the German and Italian embassies, and there was some lovey-dovey language in these letters. And one letter referred to a, quote, scoundrel whom it called D. Who was this D person? D could be anybody. There was absolutely nothing to indicate that this mysterious D person was Dreyfus. And so Picquart decided to conduct an investigation of this Esterhazy guy whose handwriting matched that of the spy who had written the bordereau. And Picquart found out 4 things. Number 1, Esterhazy had the artillery knowledge necessary to have written the bordereau. Number 2, Esterhazy was also in contact with the German embassy by letter. Number 3, Esterhazy was deep in debt. Spies are always deep in debt. And number 4, he had already sold the Germans many documents of little value. Picquart took his findings to his superiors at the General Staff of the War Ministry. Was he praised for this discovery? No. Picquart was told to stop the investigation immediately. The Dreyfus conviction was considered a done deal. And when Picquart refused to stop his investigation, he was transferred to a post in Tunisia in December 1896. Picquart's superiors were literally hoping that Picquart would be killed in Tunisia and that the Dreyfus Affair would just go away. Just before all that, in September 1896, Dreyfus' brother Mathieu had a journalist named Bernard Lazare publish a story about the existence of this secret file that the defense never got to see or even know about. In response, 2 generals instructed Major Hubert Joseph Henri, still second in command at the SR at that time, to, quote, grow the file. They knew that there was really nothing at all in it. They knew that if that file ever went public, there had better be something of substance in there. Picquart was effectively out of the way by December 1896, and this gave Henri the chance to do what he wanted in the SR. Why did they ask the second in command of the SR, Hubert Joseph Henri, to grow the file? Why didn't they ask the commander of the SR, Colonel Georges Picquart, to grow the file? Well, keep in mind that Henri was already complicit in Dreyfus' conviction with his testimony about this mysterious, respectable person. Perhaps they also knew that Picquart had too much integrity to go along with evidence tampering. In November 1896, Major Henri showed his superiors this letter that the SR had intercepted, and they called it the 1896 document. It was a letter from the Italian military attaché Alessandro Panizzardi to the German military attaché Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen. These 2 guys were lovers, and they shared intelligence and espionage all the time. And some of their letters had been in the secret file, and one of those letters had mentioned that D person. Well, this new 1896 document was different because it referenced Alfred Dreyfus by name. It said something to the effect of, if Dreyfus, the Jew, is ever brought in for questioning, we need to deny having anything to do with him. In fact, here are the exact words. I read that a deputy will call on Dreyfus. If you ask further explanations from Rome, I would say that I never had relations with the Jew. That is understood. If asked, speak like that, because that person should never know what happened with him. And then the letter was signed by the Italian attaché. Henri's superiors showed this letter to the current war minister, Jean-Baptiste Biot, and his reaction was, well, there you go. Looks like Dreyfus was guilty after all, and Picquart didn't know what he was talking about. Henri himself hated Picquart. In fact, he accused Picquart of embezzling money from the SR, and Picquart protested and returned to Paris to confront Henri's accusations. Meanwhile, Georges Picquart happened to be talking to a friend of his, Louis Leblois. Picquart casually told him, effectively, you can't repeat this, but I happen to know that Alfred Dreyfus is not the traitor. Dreyfus didn't write the bordereau. An officer named Ferdinand Esterhazy wrote it. He's the traitor. And Louis Leblois was like, you're kidding. Louis Leblois later went to the vice president of the French Senate, Auguste Scheuer-Kestner. And Leblois said, you're never going to believe what I found out. A guy named Ferdinand Esterhazy wrote the bordereau. And Auguste Scheuer-Kestner was like, you're joking. And then on November 11th, 1897, Auguste Scheuer-Kestner took this information directly to none other than Alfred Dreyfus's own brother, Mathieu, who, as we know, had been championing his brother's defense for years. 4 days later, Mathieu had this information published in an open complaint to the War Minister, and the whole thing blew up. The bordereau was published for the first time so that everyone could decide for themselves whose handwriting it actually was. And when confronted with this new evidence, Esterhazy claimed he was innocent of writing the bordereau. Tons of anti-Semitic newspapers supported Esterhazy's claim of innocence. Other newspapers claimed it was proof of Dreyfus' innocence. The Ministry of War was forced to defend Ferdinand Esterhazy. If they did otherwise, they would have to admit that they convicted the wrong man with no evidence, so they didn't have much of a choice. Instead, the Ministry of War launched their own, quote, investigation. They concluded that the real criminal here was Georges Picquart because he leaked all of these slanderous lies about Esterhazy. Picquart was accused of forging the Petit Bleu, the letter that had led him to Esterhazy in the first place. So it looked like the Ministry of War was going to be able to successfully keep Ferdinand Esterhazy out of the Dreyfus Affair. But then, Esterhazy's ex-girlfriend from 10 years previously came forward and exposed all these letters that Esterhazy had written to her 10 years ago. In these letters, Esterhazy went on and on about how much he hated the army and hated France. The proof that he wrote these letters was so strong that Esterhazy was forced to admit that he wrote them. All of this was happening in front of an avid public. Riots were happening in the streets all over France between Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards at this point. Why? I think that for the French, it was about much more than whether an accused spy was guilty or innocent. I think that the French intuitively saw in this case the debate over what kind of a people they wanted to be and what they wanted to stand for as a people. So the Ministry of War obviously did not like Esterhazy. He was an embarrassment and a problem. So they cooked up this plan. We are going to have Esterhazy demand a trial, and then we're going to make sure that he's acquitted, and then this whole thing is going to finally blow over. And so Esterhazy had his trial in January of 1898. He appeared before cheering crowds. The adoration he got was so strong that he had trouble leaving the courtroom. Here he is, a traitor to these people, and they love him, because it's better to love a shady, low-life character like Esterhazy than it is to love a Jew. 3 experts testified that the bordereau was not in Esterhazy's handwriting. Then the judges deliberated on the verdict for a total of 3 minutes. They acquitted him after 3 minutes. But that's not all. Then they declared Esterhazy unfit for service, and then they retired him, and they finally let him go into exile in England. What is it that makes patriotic people turn a blind eye to and excuse the actions of an obvious traitor to his nation? In this case, it was anti-Semitism. The French government used anti-Semitism to incite the people in favor of Esterhazy, not because they liked him, they knew he was a bum, but because he was the only thing that stood between them and public exposure to their corruption. And they saw it as absolutely vital to maintain the army's honor in the eyes of the public. One of the persons who was outraged by this verdict was Emile Zola. He was already a literary superstar, and he was at the height of his career. On January the 13th, 1898, Emile Zola published an open letter to the President of France called J'accuse, I accuse. It laid out the whole corrupt business. It named names from the top down. It set the whole country on fire. By this time, the Dreyfus Affair had been elevated to just being called the affair. You just say the affair, and everybody knew what affair you were talking about. And this was the extent to which it consumed French public life. Why did Emile Zola pull out all the stops in his editorial I accuse? He literally wanted the authorities to come after him. His plan was, I'm going to get them to charge me with libel. Then, during my trial, I can push for a review of the Dreyfus case. In France, at that time, defamation of a public authority was a criminal offense. So the trial of Emile Zola began on February the 7th, 1898. There was extreme violence throughout the trial. Zola had to be protected from violent mobs in and out of the trial. Of the hundreds of lines that Emile Zola wrote in I Accuse, the prosecution only focused on 18. Emile Zola's rights as a defendant were constantly violated throughout the proceedings. This is a picture of Emile Zola being attacked by a mob on his way to the courtroom, and you can see that a police detail had to be assigned to protect him at all times. The judge did everything possible to prevent the details of the Dreyfus Affair from being discussed in the trial. However, the public came to know many details about the Dreyfus Affair that it had not known before, and this strengthened the Dreyfusards' standing in the public debate. Emile Zola's lawyer was Fernando Labori, and Labori could see the writing on the wall. Labori knew that the verdict was not going to go Emile Zola's way, and so he advised Zola to get out of France and go to England. So Zola actually escaped to England before the verdict was announced. Zola was convicted on February 23, 1898. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail and a 3,000 franc fine. So the trial was a victory for the anti-Dreyfusards. One good thing did come out of the trial. Matthew Dreyfus and Alfred Dreyfus's wife were able to apply for a revision on the 1894 trial based on the now established fact that Alfred Dreyfus' defense, Edgar Damage, had never been shown that secret file. In June 1898, there was a new minister of war named Godfrey Cavaignac, and he believed that Dreyfus was guilty. Most people still did, but he also believed that Dreyfus deserved a new trial because his defense had been denied access to or even knowledge of this secret file. So in July, Cavaignac testified before the French Chamber of Deputies, kind of like our House of Representatives, and he assured the chamber that, hey, it's all going to be okay, because Cavaignac had seen the secret file and there was this document in it from 1896 that clearly named Dreyfus and clearly showed that he was guilty. He was talking about that 1896 document that Major Henri had shown his superiors. So Cavaignac was like, we're fine. We've got nothing to worry about. Once again, we're talking about that 1896 document that Major Henri had, quote, found, and it had been from the Italian military attaché to the German military attaché. And that letter had indeed mentioned Dreyfus by name, so Cavaignac was not wrong about this. And in this letter, the Italian spy had advised the German spy to say that they never knew the Jew. Remember that Major Henri had been ordered 2 years previously to grow the file, when Dreyfus' case file had barely anything in it. Now, this thing had 365 documents in it. It was chock full of irrelevant trash that had nothing at all to do with the case. So Henri had been a busy bee. The very next day, Georges Picquart told a Swiss newspaper in response to Cavaignac's speech to the Chamber of Deputies essentially this: I don't know what document Cavaignac is talking about. 2 of these documents are from 1894 and have nothing to do with Dreyfus. I've never seen this 1896 document, but from everything I hear, and I quote, it has all the characteristics of a fake. Georges Picquart was immediately arrested and charged with, quote, violation of professional secrecy. He got 11 months in prison for the statements he made in that interview. This is a picture of Georges Picquart at his trial. War Minister Cavaignac read Picquart's comments, though, and he knew that the Dreyfusards were going to get a revision of Alfred Dreyfus' trial. In fact, Cavaignac was in support of that. He thought that was fair. He also knew that the secret file's contents were going to be made public, and Cavaignac wanted to be absolutely sure that it proved Dreyfus' guilt. Newspapers were reproducing documents that made Esterhazy look like the guilty one in spite of his previous acquittal. So Cavaignac ordered his staff to examine this secret file for any possible problems. On August 13, 1898, Battalion Chief Louis Quinier was examining the 1896 document per Minister of War Godfrey Cavaignac's orders. Quinier worked for the War Ministry, and Louis Quinier discovered something incredible about the 1896 document. The ink in the header and in the footer of the letter was a slightly different color than the ink in the body of the letter. Up to this point, no one had really examined the 1896 document closely. They had just taken it at face value. Quinier showed this discrepancy to his boss, War Minister Cavaignac, and Quinier said, "We've got a problem. The 1896 document really is a fake, just like Georges Picquart is serving a prison sentence for saying it was." And so first they confronted Esterhazy in England. They knew Esterhazy was a creep. They knew he hated Dreyfus. And Esterhazy freaked out and confessed to some petty new stuff that he had done. But it became obvious that Esterhazy was not the one who created this fake 1896 document. It had been someone else. So then they went to Hubert Joseph Henri, the current head of the SR, and the one who had found this document in the first place. And Henri confessed to being the one who faked the 1896 document. Henri was arrested, and while in custody the next day, Henri slit his own throat. And the 1896 document became known from then on as the Faux Henri. Catch the strategy that Henri used to tamper with evidence. He had used an authentic letter as a starting point to lend authenticity and credibility to his false evidence. And this enabled his fakery to look all the more authentic and credible. And if you can add an element of homosexuality and debauchery to the mix, so much the better for your case. Framing people for a crime. Any criminal defense lawyer will tell you that when the powers that be seek to frame a defendant, whether it's the police or the prosecution, etc., the majority of the time, they do not believe that they are pinning a crime on an innocent person. The majority of the time, they are convinced that the person is guilty, and they're just trying to nudge the verdict in the right direction by adding some fake evidence just to get the case over the hump. And that's what I think happened here. I think the general staff of the SR and Major Henri wanted to believe that they had their man. And their judgment was clouded by their prejudices, their biases, their eagerness to redeem the department in the eyes of the public, and their resentment of Jewish military officers who were educated in non-traditional military colleges like Dreyfus was. So the momentum for revision of the trial started to build and build, and the Dreyfus Affair was changing the political landscape of France. One resignation after another was happening in the SR and in the Ministry of War. The president of the Council of Ministers, Henri Bresson, resigned. The new prime minister, Charles Dupuy, announced in 1898, "We are going to have this revision before the French Supreme Court, and whatever the Supreme Court says, that is what we are going with." Meanwhile, Alfred Dreyfus himself was still imprisoned back on Devil's Island. The end of 1898 was the first time since his arrival on Devil's Island that Dreyfus even knew about his new trial. Up to that point, all of Dreyfus' mail was being censored, so he didn't have a clue that he was at the center of a firestorm that was tearing France apart. So it took a while to get him back to France from Devil's Island, and he was put in a French military prison in July 1899. Alfred Dreyfus' new trial opened up in August 1899. He had two familiar lawyers working as a team. His old defense attorney, Edgar Demange, from the first trial, was back for more, and Fernand Laborie, who had been Emile Zola's defense attorney, was also back for more. At first, the two attorneys disagreed on their ultimate goal. Fernand Laborie was like, let's use this trial to bring the whole corrupt, stinking military down. Edgar Demange was like, how about we just concentrate on getting our client free? It took a lot of talking, even from the president of France, even from Emile Zola himself. But Fernand Laborie was finally convinced just to concentrate on freeing their client. During the trial, Alfred Dreyfus himself looked really emaciated and in poor health, but he was mentally sharp. His lawyer, Fernand Laborie, actually got shot in the back on his way to the court building, and because of that, he was out for several days. But then he managed to make it to court even with his wound. This time, Dreyfus was sentenced to 10 years by a vote of 5 guilty to 2 not guilty. If the vote had been 4 guilty and 3 not guilty, that would have meant an acquittal. And as it was, the 2 who voted not guilty were disobeying a direct order to vote Dreyfus guilty. However, this time the conviction was guilty of treason with extenuating circumstances. By this time, the Dreyfus Affair had become so international that there were anti-French protests in 20 foreign capitals. This was a case where the truth was in direct competition with other important values: the honor of the military, national security, public confidence in the government, diplomatic relations. There was actually relief at the conviction in Germany and Italy. The involvement of their military attachés in their Paris embassies had been quite embarrassing for those two governments. The very next day, on September the 10th, Alfred Dreyfus filed for an appeal to get a third trial. But the French president had one more option to somehow make this whole affair go away, and that was to offer Alfred Dreyfus a pardon. That sounds great to some, but the problem with accepting a pardon is you're also admitting guilt. But Dreyfus had already done 4.5 years on Devil's Island, and he just couldn't see going back to prison in that horrible place. So he signed the pardon on September 19th, 1899. 2 days later, Alfred Dreyfus was finally set free. Some of his closest supporters accused him of selling out by signing that pardon. But they weren't looking at another 10 years at Devil's Island like he was. Dreyfus' health was already permanently damaged, and there was a good chance that he would not survive another 10 years. 2 months later, on November the 17th, the Prime Minister filed an Amnesty Bill, and it covered all criminal acts related to the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus himself was excluded from the Amnesty Bill. It didn't apply to him, but it did permit him to continue to seek an acquittal, even with his pardon, if he so chose. This Amnesty Bill was great in one way. People like Emile Zola and Georges Picquart, who had put themselves on the line and risked everything for Alfred Dreyfus at great personal cost, they received amnesty. But it was also bad because the real culprits, who had falsified evidence and ignored due process, who had spied and committed treason, they were covered also. What does everybody do after something like this is finally over? They write a book, of course, and books about the affair were coming out left and right for years, and that kept the story alive for years. 3 years after the pardon, Emile Zola died in a home accident involving fumes from his chimney. And there was, of course, a grand funeral for this giant of French literature. The Paris chief of police didn't want Alfred Dreyfus to attend. He felt that it would cause, quote, problems. But Zola's friends said, forget you, he is coming. So he was there. In 1905, the Minister of War launched a final official investigation of the Dreyfus Affair. And that investigation produced an 800-page report that denounced the Army for the way it had treated Alfred Dreyfus, and it recommended canceling Dreyfus' conviction completely. This is a picture of Alfred Dreyfus and his brother, Mathieu. In 1906, the French Supreme Court did exactly what that report recommended. And the very next day, Dreyfus was reinstated into the Army as a major. Dreyfus retired the following year, but he served in the reserves during World War I. Also in 1906, Georges Picquart was appointed French Minister of War, and he served that position for 3 years. Picquart died from falling off a horse in January 1914 at the age of 59. He died before the horrors of World War I began. Alfred Dreyfus died in 1935 at the age of 75. The Dreyfus Affair had exposed deep French anti-Semitism to the world, in society, in the army, and it exposed French government corruption to the world. It sparked a new nationalist movement, Zionism. Jewish Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl followed the entire Dreyfus Affair, and he became convinced that the only way that Jews could avoid anti-Semitism was to have their own sovereign nation. And in 1897, he founded the first Zionist Congress. The Zionist movement eventually made the State of Israel possible in Palestine beginning in 1948. And as we know, the Arab-Israeli conflict has no end in sight to this day. The Dreyfus Affair turned France legally into a secular society to this day. And this extreme secularization was written into the French Constitution, and it's referred to as la laïcité. La laïcité, secularism, is the legal separation of church and state as well as all other aspects of French public life. And this was made into law in 1905, and it's a fundamental part of the French Constitution, and it's a direct result of the Dreyfus Affair. In France, you are allowed no public displays of religion of any kind. If you're a Muslim, you're not allowed to wear a hijab in public. If you're a Jew, you're not allowed to wear a yarmulke in public. And if you're a Christian, you can wear a cross, but it has to be a small one, and it has to be under your clothes. No overt religious activities are allowed in public places. French Republicans also gained a lot of power in France as a result of the loss of confidence that people had in the French conservatives. French Republicans also blamed the Catholic Church for much of the anti-Dreyfus animosity. While in power, the French Republicans severed all ties between the Catholic Church and the French state. Catholic orders that had run French schools were forced to leave the country. And this gave the French government much more control over education in France. The government seized church property, and the government stopped paying clerical salaries. Finally, the Dreyfus Affair was a clarification of the values within the entire French society, much like the U.S. Civil War was a clarification of the values within our American society. In the end, the people of France chose these things. They chose to reconfirm the meaning of 1789. They chose to reconfirm the meaning of a republic. They chose to reconfirm equality under the law. And they chose to reconfirm the sacred rights of the individual in France, even if that individual happened to be Jewish. And they chose to reconfirm civilian authority over military authority. In the end, the French people decided that fighting for the Republic and for due process even on behalf of a wealthy bourgeois Jew like Alfred Dreyfus, mattered and was worth doing.